In the morning, he finally slid those divorce papers across the mahogany table, so certain she would weep, beg, fall apart. She did something no one expected. She placed her hand gently on the papers, looked him dead in the eyes, and spoke three quiet words that cracked something open inside him he would never be able to close again. She had saved his name, his estate, his legacy, and he never once asked how. For 8 years, Abigail Harrington poured her life into a man who looked through her like glass. If you've ever felt invisible to someone who should have seen you most, stay with us. This one is for you. The rain had been falling over Harrington Manor for 3 days straight. Not the soft, forgiving kind of rain that washes things clean. The heavy kind. The kind that presses down on rooftops and fills silence with sound, so that a person cannot hear themselves think or feel or breathe without the weight of water in the air reminding them that something, somewhere, is drowning. Inside the library, though, there was no sound at all. The grandfather clock on the far wall had stopped at 7:30 that morning. No one had wounded. The fire in the hearth had burned itself down to orange coals. The candles on the writing desk were low and guttering, throwing long shadows that stretched across the Persian rug like reaching fingers. And William Harrington sat perfectly still behind his desk. He was not a man given to visible distress. At 34, he carried himself the way men of his breeding were taught to, shoulder squared, jaw set, the particular stillness of someone who had learned early that showing feeling was a form of weakness. His father had taught him that. His grandfather before that. The Harrington men did not tremble. They did not second guess. They decided, and the world arranged itself accordingly. At least, that was what he told himself. On the desk before him sat two things: a glass of red wine untouched, the color of old blood in the dim light, and divorce papers, crisp, official, bearing the seal of his solicitor in London, who had taken great pains to ensure everything was in order. Across from him, in the high-backed chair that had always seemed slightly too large for her, as though the house itself had never quite decided how to hold her, sat Abigail, his wife. 8 years. She was 31 now, and she wore it differently than most women of her station. There were no elaborate curls, no powdered pretensions. Her dark hair was pinned simply at the nape of her neck. Her dress was the deep blue of a winter sky just before dark, practical, not ornamental. She had always dressed that way, even when society expected otherwise, and William had always filed the observation away somewhere and forgotten it by morning. She was watching him, not with the expression he had expected, not the pale, crumbling look of a woman praying for impact. Her hands were folded quietly in her lap. Her face was composed in a way that unnerved him, though he could not have explained precisely why. William reached forward. He slid the papers across the table. The sound parchment on polished mahogany moved through the silence like a blade. Abigail, her eyes moved to his face, not down to the papers. Not away. I believe we both know, he paused, cleared his throat. This marriage has been finished for some time. Something crossed her face. Not the anger he had steeled himself for. Not tears. Something slower and somehow more cutting: recognition. As though she had already known he would say exactly those words. As though she had rehearsed receiving them long before this morning. We have become strangers. He straightened in his chair. Surely you can see that. The fire crackled once, low and tired. Abigail looked around the library. Her gaze moved slowly across the shelves of leather-bound volumes, across the writing desk stacked with estate ledgers, across the window where rain tracked gray lines down old glass. She looked at the room the way a person looks at something they are memorizing, or something they are letting go. Then she looked back at him, and she placed her hand on the divorce papers, not pushing them away, not picking them up, just resting her palm on them, as if to acknowledge their presence. Their reality. You never knew me. 3 words. Quiet as a door closing in another room. William's mouth opened, then closed, because they were not angry words. They were not meant to wound or accuse or destroy. They were simply true, spoken the way a woman speaks a truth she has long since made peace with, because the fighting wore out years ago, and something happened in William Harrington's chest that he had no name for. A kind of stillness descended that was entirely different from the stillness he maintained by discipline. This one came from the outside in, a cold, settling thing. He stared at his wife, and for the first time in years, perhaps, for the first time ever, he actually looked at her. He had met Abigail Mercer in the spring of 1811, at a gathering hosted by the Caldwell family in their estate outside of Charleston. She was not the most fashionable woman in the room. She was not the most celebrated. The Mercer name was respectable, but modest. No grand titles, no storied lineage, no inherited fortune that would make marriage to her daughter a strategic triumph. But she had said something that evening that William never entirely forgot. He had been standing beside Colonel Ashford, enduring a tedious conversation about tax policy, when he overheard her across the room, surrounded by 3 young women, who were laughing at something he couldn't hear say, perfectly calmly. "I don't think it matters much what a man is worth on paper. What matters is what he does when no one is watching." He had turned to look at her. She hadn't been performing. She hadn't been speaking loudly or angling for attention. She had simply been saying what she thought, the way some people do when they forget the room is full of ears. He had crossed the parlor. He had introduced himself, and Abigail Mercer had looked at him with steady gray eyes and said, "I know who you are, Mr. Harrington. The question is whether you know who you'd like to become." William had laughed. He hadn't expected to. By the end of that evening, he had decided he would marry her. He told himself it was her intelligence, her calm, the way she was unimpressed by him in a room full of people who were very much impressed. He had spent his whole life surrounded by people who wanted something from the Harrington name, and here was a woman who seemed to want nothing at all, or rather, wanted something so specific and serious that it had no relation to titles or inheritance. She wanted, he would eventually understand, to be known. And he had never understood how to give her that. What does that mean? William's voice came out harder than he intended. Abigail didn't flinch. "It means you know my name." A pause. "You know my place beside you at dinner. You know that I prefer the east-facing rooms because of the morning light. You know I take my tea without sugar." Another pause. "But you don't know who I am." He stopped himself. He had been about to say ridiculous. He was glad he stopped. Because even in the moment of his own defensiveness, something in him recognized the accuracy of her words, and the defensiveness faltered. "We have lived in the same house for 8 years, Abigail." "Yes," she folded her hands back in her lap, "we have." The brevity of her agreement was more damning than any argument she could have made. William pushed back from the desk slightly, restless. The kind of man who, when confronted with something he cannot immediately solve, becomes physically uncomfortable in stillness. "I have provided everything you could want. You have wanted for nothing. This house is a beautiful house." She looked at him steadily. "Yes." Then what? He pressed his fingers flat against the desk. "Then what do you want from me? What is it that I have failed to?" "I never wanted your provision, William." Her voice didn't rise, didn't sharpen. It was the consistency of it, the unchanging, measured calm that unsettled him most. "I married you because I believed you were someone who would grow alongside me. Someone who was curious about the world, about people. You were when you were young." He was quiet. "I'm not old." No, she almost smiled. It didn't reach her eyes. "But you became certain very quickly, and certain men stop asking questions. Because when you already know every answer." She looked at him. "Why would you ask?" William stood up. He walked to the window, stood with his back to her, watching the rain. Outside, the estate spread in every direction, fields, stables, the tenant cottages, visible in distance through the gray curtain of water. Hundreds of acres. A name that stretched back 150 years. A legacy he had spent the better part of his adult life protecting. He had always thought of it as his. But, standing there, rain on the glass, divorce papers on the desk, the voice of his wife behind him, he thought, for the very first time, about how much of this place had actually passed through her hands. "I want to understand what you're saying." He didn't turn around. Abigail was quiet for a long moment. Then, without urgency, she rose from her chair. She walked to a cabinet on the far wall, one with the dark oak paneling that William had always assumed held old journals and correspondence he had never gotten around to sorting. She opened it with a small key from the chain at her wrist. She lifted out a box. Not large, not ornate. Simply a wooden box, the wood darkened with age and handling, the kind of object that holds what is important rather than what is impressive. She placed it on the desk. William turned from the window. "What is it?" He looked at her. Then at the box. Then he crossed the room and lifted the lid. Inside was paper. Organized, layered, carefully preserved. Documents. Ledgers with handwriting he recognized as hers. Record. Several pages stamped with the seals of merchants and solicitors in Charleston and Savannah and even Boston. He looked up at her. "The parts of my life you never asked about," she said. He reached in. He lifted the first document. It was a letter, formal, precise, addressed to a merchant named Calloway who had been pressing the estate for repayment of a substantial debt. The letter negotiated an extension with terms William had never known existed. The date on the letter was 1814. 3 years ago. He had been in Charleston during that entire month, attending to political meetings he'd considered urgent. He lifted the second document, a plan in Abigail's hand. 17 pages. A restructuring of the estate's land management, crop rotation schedules, revised tenant lease agreements, a proposal for a drainage system in the lower fields that had been flooding every reef for as long as anyone could remember. William remembered the flooding. He remembered being told it had been handled without remembering who had handled it. He lifted a third document, and then a fourth. His hand slowed. Each page revealed something he had not known, something that had happened inside his own house, on his own land, under his own name, while he had been elsewhere. While he had been deciding things, and attending things, and being present in every room except the ones that actually mattered. He found a note, short, handwritten on plain paper, from a man named Joseph Tatum, who worked the East Tenant Farm. The handwriting was rough, the spelling imperfect, but the meaning was unmistakable. Lady Abigail came herself when my wife was sick and we couldn't pay the month. She said we could pay when we were able and not to worry about it. I don't know many women like her. I don't know many people like her. William set the note down. He found another one, then another. Small, grateful, painfully sincere notes from workers and tenants and a school mistress in the village whose roof had been repaired through funds Abigail had quietly redirected from the household accounts without ever mentioning it to him. He found the plan she had written for the northern granary, which he had taken credit for, at a county meeting in 1815 without knowing where the idea had originated, because he had assumed it came from his estate manager. His estate manager, who had told William it was his own idea. Because Abigail had handed it to the estate manager without her name on it, wanting only that it be implemented, not that it be attributed. William's jaw tightened. He reached the bottom of the box. And there, beneath everything else, was a single folded letter. Not sealed, not sent. The paper was soft at the folds, as though it had been opened and closed many times. He looked up at Abigail. She was watching him with the same composed expression she had worn all morning. But her hands, he noticed her hands were no longer folded. They were pressed flat against her thighs. He unfolded the letter. The handwriting was hers, but different from the formal, careful script of her documents. This was smaller, more urgent. The letters pressed into the page with feeling rather than precision. Dear William, I don't know whether I will ever send this. I suspect I won't. You would read it and apologize and nothing would change, and then I would feel worse for having said it than I did for carrying it. But I need to write it. So here it is. I wish you would see me. Not Lady Harrington. Not your wife at the table. Not the woman who manages your house while you are away, managing everything you believe matters more. I wish you would see me, the person standing beside you, and ask, who are you? What do you want? Are you happy? Are you well? 8 years, William. 8 years I have waited for one morning where you wake and look at me the way you looked at me in the Caldwell parlor. Like I was interesting, like I was worth knowing. I am not angry. I want you to know that I am not angry. I am simply tired. Tired of being present in every room and invisible in all of them. If you ever read this, if some version of you ever opens this box and reads these words, I hope it is not too late for you to ask someone, somewhere, the one question that costs nothing and means everything. Who are you? Who are you really? Your wife Abigail. William did not move for a long time. The rain continued. The coals in the fireplace shifted and settled. Somewhere in the house, a door opened and closed. A servant, going about the business of the morning, unaware that in the library the world had rearranged itself around something small and devastating. When William finally looked up from the letter, his eyes were different. Not wet. Harrington men did not weep in front of others. But different, the particular look of a man who has just understood something that cannot be understood and then put back in the comfortable shape it occupied before. His voice came out rough. He cleared it. This letter. I wrote it 4 years ago. She didn't move toward him. After the winter you came home from Boston and didn't ask how the estate had fared through the ice storm. I had been awake for 3 nights. A tenant's barn had collapsed. I had organized the repair myself. When you arrived, you told me about a dinner party you had attended. She stopped. Then I smiled and asked if the food was good. He stared at her. Because that was what you wanted from me. She picked up her gloves from the arm of the chair. She must have placed them there when she sat down. He hadn't noticed. Someone who asked about the dinner party. Abigail, I'm not accusing you. And extraordinarily, she meant it. The steadiness in her voice was not suppressed fury. It was the steadiness of a woman who has grieved something long enough to arrive at the other side. I don't think you were cruel. I don't think you chose any of this deliberately. I think you simply never questioned it. Never looked hard enough to see what wasn't being said. William set the letter down on the desk. He looked at the box. All those papers, all those years, you saved this estate. The words felt strange in his mouth. Not because they were unfamiliar, but because he was saying them as a discovery, and they should have been something he knew. I loved this estate, she said simply. I loved what it could be. For the tenants, for the land, for the people who depend on it. A pause. I thought I loved you, and for a long time I believed if I simply did enough, if I proved enough, you would finally turn and see me standing there. I did see you. The look she gave him then was not unkind. But it was honest in the way that truly kind people can sometimes be honest, the kind of honesty that doesn't soften the truth, but doesn't enjoy delivering it either. You saw a woman in your house, she said. You saw a wife at your table. You saw what you expected to see. And so she touched the edge of the box, very briefly. That is all I was. William looked down at the divorce papers on the desk, then back at the box, the letter, the 17-page land management plan she had written by hand, at this very desk, in this very library, while he slept. Something tightened in his throat. He pressed it back. What do you want me to say? His voice was lower now. The authority had gone out of it. He sounded not young, exactly, but unexpectedly uncertain. Like a man standing in a room and realizing, very suddenly, that he does not know where he is. Tell me what you want me to say. Abigail looked at him for a long moment. Then she straightened her shoulders. That's just it, William. She reached for her gloves. I don't want you to say anything. I wanted you to ask. There is a very significant difference. She met his eyes once more. Saying is easy, saying costs nothing. Asking that requires you to stop, to look, to actually want to know the answer. She picked up the gloves. Did not put them on. You never asked. The clock on the mantel, not the grandfather clock. The smaller one above the fireplace that still kept time, marked the half hour with a soft chime. Outside, the rain intensified for one long moment and then softened. William stood on one side of the desk, and Abigail stood on the other, and between them were 8 years of papers and silence, and a letter that had never been sent. Don't sign those today. His voice came out as something close to a request. Perhaps the first true request he had made of her in years, not an instruction, not an expectation, but an actual asking. Please. Abigail looked at the papers. She did not touch them. She looked back at him. I'll think about it, she said. And then she walked toward the library door. With the measured, unhurried grace of a woman who had learned long ago that she had nowhere left to rush to because she had been arriving, unnoticed, for years. At the doorway, she stopped. She did not turn around. But she paused, one hand on the doorframe, the other still holding her gloves, and she said quietly, into the space between them, she loved you very much, that woman who wrote that letter. I want you to know that. Whatever happens, she did. She left, the door closed softly. William stood in the library alone. Around him, 8 years of a life, the wine still untouched, the fire nearly out, the box open on the desk, all those pages spread like a map of a country he had never once thought to visit. He reached out and picked up the unsent letter again. I wish you would see me, the person standing beside you, and ask, who are you? He read it once, twice, he set it down, he walked to the window. And for a very long time William Harrington did not move. Did not strategize, did not plan, did not manage or direct or decide. He simply stood there, watching the rain, and feeling for the first time in a very long time the weight of everything he had never bothered to carry. She had held this estate together with her hands and her mind and her heart, and he had never thought to look. He had spent 8 years living beside the most extraordinary woman he had ever met, and he had been too certain to see her. If you have ever stood in a room full of people and felt completely invisible to the one person who mattered most, you know exactly what Abigail felt. And if you want to know what she does next, whether she signs those papers, whether William ever truly understands what he lost, whether love can find its way back after a silence that long, then stay with us. Subscribe to this channel and don't miss a single part of this story, because the next chapter changes everything. Part 2: The Wife Who Held Everything Together. The library door had barely closed before William moved. Not toward the papers, not toward the box. He moved the way a man moves when the ground beneath him has shifted without warning, reactive, unsteady, reaching for something solid without knowing what he's reaching for. He pulled the bell cord near the fireplace. His butler, Graves, appeared within 2 minutes. Tall, composed, the kind of man who had spent 30 years learning to read the temperature of a room before he crossed the threshold. He read this one immediately. "Sir, where is Lady Harrington?" A pause, brief but noticeable. "She has gone upstairs, sir. I believe she asked for her traveling trunk to be brought down from the attic." The words landed in William's chest like something dropped from a height. "Her trunk, yes, sir." He dismissed Graves with a gesture and turned back to the window. Her trunk. She had not signed the papers, not yet, but she had asked for her trunk, which meant she had already decided, at some point before this morning, before the library, before any of this, she had already what she would do if he pushed those papers across the desk. She had planned for the ending of this, and he had not even seen it coming. That realization, not the papers, not the box, not even the unsent letter, that was the thing that finally broke through the carefully maintained composure of William Harrington's chest. Because it meant the ending had not been a sudden thing. It had been growing for years, in the silence between them, while he looked at everything except her. He picked up the letter from the desk again. "I don't think you were cruel. I don't think you chose any of this deliberately." Those words, coming from her, were somehow worse than accusation. If she had accused him, he could have defended himself. He was practiced at defense. He had spent his entire adult life navigating men who wanted to take things from him: land, influence, money, reputation, and he had held every one of them at arm's length with the confidence of someone who believed he always knew where the threat was coming from. He had never once considered that the damage was coming from inside his own silence. He set the letter down, carefully, like something that could break a second time. He needed to understand something, and the only way to understand it was to go backward to the beginning of the 8 years that had just collapsed around him in a library while the rain fell and the fire went out. He sat down in the chair across from his desk, her chair, the one that had always seemed too large for her. He sat in it and looked at his own desk from the other side, and it was a strange experience seeing from this angle the neat stacks of ledgers, the glass of wine he had poured and never touched, the open box with all its papers, the divorce documents waiting at the edge. From this side of the desk, everything looked different. From this side, you could see that the man behind it had his back to the window, to the estate, to the fields, to everything outside, and faced inward, always inward, toward whatever was immediately in front of him. She had sat in this chair across from him for years, and every time he had been looking at whatever was on his desk. Not at her. He pressed both hands flat on his knees. He had to think. He had to think clearly, because that was what he did. He was a man who thought clearly under pressure, who assembled facts and made decisions and moved forward. That was what made him good at what he did. That was what had made the Harrington name mean something in this part of the country. But the facts in front of him now were not the kind he knew how to assemble. A 17-page land management plan, written by his wife, implemented under his estate manager's name. Letters to creditors he had never known existed. Negotiations he had never been told about. Workers and tenants who knew his wife by name, by kindness, by the specific quality of her presence, who did not merely respect Lady Harrington, but were grateful to Abigail. And a letter soft at the folds from 4 years of being opened and closed that asked him for one thing. One thing. Who are you? What do you want? Are you happy? He put his face in his hands. He didn't cry, but to press the heel of his hands against his eyes and feel the pressure of that small, specific darkness, and let himself sit inside the truth for one moment without running from it. He had been married to a woman who held his estate together with her bare hands. He had never asked her how. He had never asked her why. He had never asked her anything. He found the estate manager, Harlow, in the stables just before noon. Harlow was a compact, careful man of 50 who had served the Harrington estate since William's father's time. He knew horses the way he knew land, patiently, without sentiment, but with a deep, practical respect for what they could do. He looked up when William appeared in the stable doorway, and something in his expression shifted. "Lord Harrington." William walked in without preamble. "I want to ask you something, Harlow, and I need a straight answer." "Of course, sir. The Northern Granary Plan. The one we implemented in 15, was it?" A pause. Something moved behind Harlow's eyes. "Yes, sir. 15. The pause this time was longer. I brought it to you, sir. I know what you brought to me. I'm asking where it came from. Harlow looked at him steadily. He was not a man who lied easily. He was too practical for it, too invested in the actual functioning of things to waste time on deception. But he was also, William could see now, a man who had been keeping someone else's secret for a long time, and was calculating how much longer it needed keeping. Lady Harrington, sir. William didn't react, or rather he reacted by becoming very still. She gave it to you. She came to me in February of that year. Said she'd been thinking about the grain loss and had some ideas. She handed me the plan herself. Harlow's jaw shifted slightly. Said she didn't want to put her name on it because she reckoned you'd give it more weight coming from me. She wasn't wrong. He paused. Begging your pardon, sir. William absorbed that. He was not begging Harlow's pardon. He deserved no pardoning here. His wife had believed correctly that a plan bearing her name would be taken less seriously than one bearing his estate manager's name. And so she had quietly handed off her own work and let another man take the credit because it was the only way to ensure it actually happened. That was not a small thing. That was a woman who had learned exactly how much she was worth to the people around her and had worked within those limits so precisely and for so long that no one had ever thought to question it. What else? William's voice was controlled. What else did she handle that came to me through someone else? Harlow was quiet for a long moment. Sir, I don't think. Harlow, he said the name once, flat and final. What else? The estate manager took a breath, and then he started talking. The flooding in the south pasture solved through a drainage rerouting that Abigail had sketched herself after corresponding with an engineer in Savannah. The labor dispute in 1813, when 3 tenant families had threatened to leave following a bad harvest, resolved because Abigail had quietly visited each family, listened to their grievances, and arranged a modified lease that kept them on the land. The merchant Calloway's debt not just extended but restructured. Because Abigail had done something no one else had thought to do, she had looked at Calloway's own accounts, discovered he was overextended himself, and offered him terms he could actually manage, which meant he didn't default and the estate got paid. Harlow talked for 20 minutes. William listened without a word. When Harlow finished, there was a long silence between them, filled with the quiet sounds of horses shifting in their stalls. Why did no one tell me? William's voice was even. Too even. Harlow looked at him directly. Because Lady Harrington asked us not to, sir. Another pause. And because he stopped. Say it. Because those of us who worked closely with her reckoned you'd want done your way once you knew. And her way was working. He held William's gaze without apology. Better than most. William turned and walked out of the stables. He walked through the rain without a hat, without a coat, across the muddy path to the tenant cottages, because he needed to move and he needed to see, and he could not stay inside the house for one more minute while the full weight of 8 years pressed down on him from the inside. The first cottage he reached belonged to the Tatum family. Joseph Tatum was working in his doorway, repairing a tool, when he looked up and startled visibly at the sight of Lord Harrington standing in his yard in the pouring rain. "My lord, I found your note." William stopped a few feet away. "In the box your note about my wife." Tatum went very still. He was a plain-spoken man, broad-shouldered, with the particular wariness of someone who had learned that powerful men arriving unexpectedly rarely brought good news. "I meant every word of it, sir." He said it carefully but without retraction. "Tell me what happened." William stood in the rain. "The winter she came here." Tatum looked at him for a long moment. Then he set down his tool. 14. Winter of 14. "My wife Mary, she got sick. Couldn't work. We had 2 little ones and the third coming, and the payment was due, and he stopped, pressed his mouth flat, looked away for a moment. I went to Mr. Harlow. I waited. Payment was still due. And my wife," Tatum looked back at him, "didn't send a servant, didn't send a note. She came herself in the cold and knocked on that door." He pointed to the cottage door behind him. Mary answered. "Lady Abigail came inside, sat down at that table right there, asked what we needed. Not what we could pay, what we needed. And when Mary started crying because she thought we were going to lose the farm, his jaw tightened. Lady Abigail held her hand, sat there for near an hour, and then she said the payment could wait as long as it needed to." William said nothing. "She came back the following week," Tatum continued, "with food. From her own kitchen. She said it was extras, that it would go to waste otherwise. But I knew, and Mary knew." He looked directly at William. "She saved this family, my lord, and she did it without ever wanting anything for it. Without he paused, without any of us thanking you for it. Because it wasn't you. The rain came down. William stood in it. He had two choices in this moment. He could be offended. He was practiced at being offended, at reasserting the order of things, at reminding people of who held authority in this county. That version of himself was available to him. It was right there, waiting, comfortable and familiar. Or he could stand in the rain and let Joseph Tatum's words fall on him, the way the water was falling, not stopping them, not redirecting them, just receiving them. He stayed. "Thank you," William said at last. The words felt strange, incomplete, nowhere near sufficient. But he said them. Tatum nodded once. William turned and walked back through the rain toward the house. He found 3 more notes in the box when he returned to the library. He had not looked at the bottom layer properly the first time. He had stopped at the letter and let that break him before he'd gone all the way down. The first was from the schoolmistress in the village, a Miss Parrish, who wrote with an educated hand and a directness that suggested she was not given to flattery. She described the day the school's roof had begun leaking so badly that classes had been canceled and the children sent home. She described how, within a week, a crew of men had arrived with supplies. She described asking where the funds had come from and being told only that they were a private donation from a well-wisher who wished to remain unnamed. She had figured it out eventually. She wasn't specific about how in the note. She was specific about what it had meant. That roof has not leaked in 3 years. Every morning those children sit at their desks and learn, and they do not know whose hands made that possible. But I do, and I think someone else should know too. The second note was from a woman William didn't recognize, an Eleanor Marsh, who had apparently been a housemaid at Harrington Manor for 3 years before leaving to marry. She described arriving at the estate young and frightened, and being met on her first day not by the housekeeper but by Lady Abigail herself, who had shown her the kitchen and explained the household routine and said, plainly, "This is your home while you work here. You will be treated accordingly." She described the way that single sentence had changed how she understood her own dignity. The third note was written in a hand William recognized. It was his own estate solicitor, Renner, in Charleston. William nearly missed it, because the letter was addressed to Abigail, not to him, and it was folded inside a larger document about property records. But it fell open as he lifted the document, and one paragraph caught his eye before he could decide not to read it. "I confess, Lady Harrington, that the Caldwell dispute would have gone significantly worse for your husband's interests had you not provided that precedent from the Beaumont case. Lord Harrington handled the meeting with his customary authority, of course, but the ground you laid in advance was what won it. I trust you understand that I say this in complete confidence, as I suspect you prefer it that way." William put the letter down very carefully. The Caldwell dispute, 1816. He remembered it, a boundary dispute over the eastern acreage that had threatened to go to arbitration and ultimately resolved in his favor. He had considered it one of his cleaner victories. He had toasted it with Renner at a club dinner and felt confident and skilled and in control. He had not known that his wife had spent 2 weeks researching legal precedent and had handed the critical argument to his solicitor before the meeting quietly, completely, and without a whisper of acknowledgement. William stood in the middle of the library and looked at the open box and felt something that he had no name for in the vocabulary he'd been given. It was not guilt, exactly, though it was close. It was not grief, though it was close to that too. It was the specific nauseating sensation of a man who has believed himself to be the architect of his own success, and who must now reckon with how much of the structure was built by someone else's hands. Someone who had asked for nothing. Someone who had wanted only to be seen. He crossed to the door of the library and opened it. In the hallway, one of the younger housemaids, a girl of perhaps 17, was carrying linens toward the back staircase. She stopped when she saw him, bobbed a nervous curtsy. "Sir, do you know Lady Harrington?" The girl blinked. The question was strange, of course. She knew Lady Harrington. This was her house. But the girl, being perceptive in the way that young people in service often were, understood that he was not asking if she knew who Lady Harrington was. He was asking if she knew her. "Yes, sir." She said it with a steadiness that surprised him slightly. "Lady Abigail taught me how to read the household accounts last winter. Said every woman ought to know how money moves." A small pause. "She taught 3 of us." William stared at her. "3 of you?" "Yes, sir. Mrs. Price, the cook, and Nettie, who helps in the garden, and me." The girl lifted her chin slightly, the kind of unconscious pride that comes from being trusted with something important. Lady Abigail said knowing numbers keeps a woman from being taken advantage of. He thanked the girl and closed the library door again. He stood in the center of the room. Outside, the rain had finally begun to ease. He thought about the woman upstairs. He thought about her traveling trunk, which was being brought down from the attic. He thought about 8 years. About a house full of people who knew his wife, who had been taught by her, helped by her, held by her, and about himself in every one of those years, knowing none of it. He had been the lord of this estate. She had been its heart. And he had spent 8 years mistaking his title for his relevance. He picked up the divorce papers from the desk. He held them in both hands. He stared at them for a long time. Then, slowly, deliberately, he folded them in half. He opened the top drawer of his desk and placed them inside, face down. He did not tear them. He was not so arrogant as to believe he had the right to destroy them. They were hers as much as his, and she had not yet signed them, and he had not yet earned the right to pretend this was his decision to make. But he was not going to look at them while he figured out how to become someone worth looking at. He walked to the writing desk. He pulled out a clean sheet of paper. He picked up a pen. He held it over the blank page for a very long time. He was practiced at letters. He wrote dozens of them every week to solicitors, to merchants, to politicians, to landowners, to people he needed things from or owed things to. He knew how to say what he meant efficiently and with authority. But he had no idea, he realized now, how to write to Abigail. He had written her letters before formal ones, early in their marriage, when he was traveling and she was home. He had summarized his meetings, described the weather in other cities, closed with appropriate warmth. She had always written back longer letters, fuller letters, letters that asked about the estate and the tenants and the specific questions of a woman who was invested in the details of the life they shared. He had skimmed them. He had replied to the parts that required replies and let the rest pass. He understood now what she had been doing in those letters. She had been showing him who she was reaching toward him, page after page, trip after trip, year after year, and he had been reading for information and not for her. He pressed the pen to the paper. He wrote, Abigail. He stopped. He crossed it out. He wrote again, I have been in the library for 4 hours. He stopped. That was not right either. It was too much about him. Everything he had written to her, he now understood, had been about him, his schedules, his meetings, his decisions, his world. Even now, beginning a letter that was meant to be about her, his instinct was to start with himself. He crossed it out. He held the pen. He thought about the girl in the hallway who had said Lady Abigail said, knowing numbers keeps a woman from being taken advantage of. He thought about Joseph Tatum, who had said she saved this family. He thought about Miss Parrish and the school roof and the roof that had not leaked in 3 years. He thought about the called dispute, one on ground his wife had laid before he even walked into the room. He thought about a woman who had folded a letter and put it in a box and never sent it because she had already known it would not reach him. He put the pen down. He could not write his way out of this. He needed to stand in front of her. He pushed back from the desk and walked to the door and opened it and went upstairs. For the first time that day, the first time in longer than that, if he was being honest with himself, and knocked on the door of the east-facing room that Abigail had always preferred because of the morning light. Silence. Then her voice, quiet and composed, come in. He opened the door. The traveling trunk sat open at the foot of the bed. She was folding a shawl with the neat, practiced movements of someone who has done this before, who has prepared to leave before, and perhaps thought better of it before, but who this time had the particular purposefulness of someone who had made a decision she intended to keep. She looked up when he entered. She did not stop folding. I spoke with Harlow. He stayed near the doorway, not crowding her. He was aware, suddenly, of how much space he had always taken up in rooms, how he had always walked to the center of things without thinking, as though the center of any room was his by right. And Tatum, and your solicitor's letter, I found it in the box. The Caldwell precedent. Abigail's hands stilled on the shawl, just for a moment. Then she continued folding. Renner shouldn't have kept that. He was protecting you, a pause, or protecting whatever you preferred to keep private. I preferred to keep everything private. She set the shawl in the trunk, reached for the next item, a wool wrap, dark green, the color of the east fields in spring, because the moment you knew it would become yours. You would have incorporated it into your own understanding of yourself, your own story, and I would have become support staff. The bluntness of it hit him like cold water. That's not, he stopped himself, because he could not say that's not true. He had been about to say it automatically, defensively, the way he always responded to challenges with swift, confident refutation. But the words stopped ins he honestly did not know. If it had happened differently, if she had told him directly and openly, he honestly did not know what he would have done with that information. Would he have seen her differently, or would he have simply absorbed it, filed it, and continued forward without changing anything at all? He didn't know. That not knowing was the most honest thing he had felt in years. "You're right," he said. "I don't know what I would have done." Abigail turned to look at him. That surprised her, he could see it, the small, careful widening of her eyes before she brought her expression back to composure. She had not expected that. She had expected defense. She had 8 years of experience with his defense. "I don't know what I would have done," he said again. And that's he paused. The words were unfamiliar. He had not practiced them. "That is not something I can excuse." She held his gaze. "No," she said softly, "it isn't. I'm not asking you to excuse it." He took one step into the room. Just one. "I'm asking you to give me enough time to understand it." Abigail looked at the open trunk. Then she looked at him. "William." She said his name with a quietness that carried more weight than volume ever could. "I have given you 8 years, I know. 8 years of trying to understand why you couldn't see me, and then 6 months of trying to understand why I kept trying." She pressed her hands flat against the wool wrap in the trunk. "I ran out of time." Or she corrected herself. "I ran out of the willingness to keep waiting for someone to see what was right in front of them." He stood in the doorway of her room. She stood at the foot of her bed beside an open trunk. Between them was the whole of 8 years, all that silence, all those unasked questions, all those documents in a box, all those letters he had skimmed, all those evenings he had come home and summarized his day without asking about hers. "Don't go today," he said. "That's all I'm asking. Not for 8 more years. Not for a second chance I haven't earned. Just don't go today." Abigail was very still. Outside the window, the rain had stopped. The silence it left behind was different from the silence that had preceded it, lighter, somehow, and full of the particular quality of air after a long storm clears. She looked at the trunk. She looked at him. She did not close the trunk. But she said, "I'll have my dinner downstairs tonight." It was not a promise. It was not forgiveness. It was the smallest possible step in a direction that was not away. And William Harrington, a man who had spent his entire life taking large steps, with great confidence understood, for the first time, that the smallest steps were sometimes the only ones that counted. "Thank you," he said. He meant it in a way he had never meant anything before. He turned and walked back down the hallway, down the stairs, and back into the library. He sat in her chair again, the high-backed one that had always seemed too large for her, and he looked at the open box on the desk. He was going to read every page, every letter, every plan, every note from every tenant and school mistress and grateful hand that had touched the hem of his wife's effort and been changed by it. He was going to read it all, not to fix it. Not yet. He had not earned the right to claim he knew how to fix anything. But because she had asked, in a letter she'd never sent, for one thing, to be known. And knowing her, truly knowing her, started here, with what she had done when no one was watching. Part 3. The truth he could never take back. She came down to dinner. That was not nothing. William had spent the hours between their conversation in her room and the evening meal doing the only thing he knew how to do. When the ground beneath him shifted, he worked. He read every page in the box, every document, every note, every record in Abigail's handwriting. He read them in order, then out of order. Then he went back to the beginning and read certain ones again, because he needed to make sure he had understood them correctly and not simply absorbed them, the way he had absorbed everything she had ever offered him, partially, distractedly, with half his attention somewhere else. He did not eat lunch. He did not notice, when Graves appeared at the library door at 6:30 to inform him that Lady Harrington had come downstairs and was waiting in the dining room, William set down the last document in the box, the 17-page land management plan, which he had saved for last, which he had read 3 times, and stood up slowly. His back ached. His eyes were tired. He had been sitting in that library for 10 hours. He straightened his coat. He walked to the dining room. She was already seated, not at the far end of the long table, where she might have placed herself to emphasize the distance between them, but at the side, in the chair she had always preferred, close to the window. There were two place settings. Someone in the household graves, probably or possibly, the cook had understood the evening's significance and arranged the room accordingly. William sat across from her. They did not speak immediately. The food was served. Soup first, the kind of simple, serious soup that a house makes in autumn when the weather has turned, and warmth is the priority over elegance. William looked at his bowl. He had not been hungry all day. Now suddenly he was. Abigail picked up her spoon. He picked up his. And for a few minutes, in the strange, fragile peace of two people who have said enormous things to each other, and not yet said all of them, they simply ate. "I read everything in the box," he began. She did not look up from her soup. "I assumed you would. The Caldwell papers, the drainage plan, the notes from Tatum and Miss Parrish." A pause. He chose the next words carefully. "The letter from Renner." Now she looked up. He should not have kept that letter. He kept it because he wanted someone to know what you'd done. William held her gaze. I think he'd been wanting someone to know for a long time. Something moved across her face, brief, complicated. Not quite gratitude, not quite grief, something between the two in that narrow space where feelings live that don't have clean names. "It doesn't matter now, it matters enormously." He set down his spoon. "Abigail, that boundary dispute, I gave a toast about it. At Renner's club dinner. I stood up in front of a room full of men and talked about my own sharpness, my own preparation, my own." He stopped. The word he had been about to use was brilliance. And, saying it now, in this room, across from this woman, felt like something he could not do. "I took credit for something you built. You didn't know. That is not the same as being innocent of it." She looked at him. He meant that. What? He could see she understood he meant it, because her expression shifted, not softened, exactly, but opened slightly, the way a door opens when someone on the other side finally knocks the right way. "No," she agreed quietly. The soup was cleared. The next course arrived. Outside, the sky had gone fully dark, and the candles on the table threw their light in a circle that made the rest of the room seem very far away. William looked at his wife. He had sat across from her at this table hundreds of times. He was seeing her for the first time. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I need you to know that I'm asking, because I genuinely want the answer. Not because I know how to respond to it, not because I have a plan. Just because I want to know." She waited. What was the worst of it? His voice was steady, but the question underneath it was not. Not the biggest thing I missed. Not the most important document in that box. What was the moment that hurt the most? The question landed in the space between them like something alive. Abigail went very still. She put her fork down. She looked at the candle flame for a moment, just a moment, and William understood that she was deciding something. Not whether to answer truthfully. Because the truth of this was something she had carried alone for a very long time, and giving it to him meant trusting him with it, and the last 8 years had given her very little evidence that he deserved that trust. But she looked back at him, and she answered, "November of 1813. He did not recognize the specific date, but he held himself still and listened. "You came home from Richmond. You'd been gone 6 weeks. Her voice was even. Practiced even. The evenness of a woman who has rehearsed composure so thoroughly that it no longer requires effort. "I had spent those 6 weeks managing a smallpox scare in the tenant cottages. It didn't spread, we caught it in time. I had organized the quarantine myself, worked with the physician, made sure every family had what they needed, wrote to the county health office." She paused. "When you came home, I was exhausted. I had not slept properly in 2 weeks. She stopped, pressed her lips together briefly. "I wanted to tell you. I wanted to sit down and say, this is what happened while you were gone. This is what I did. This is what it cost me. I wanted you to look at me and say that you saw it." He didn't move. "You came into the parlor. You were in good spirits. The Richmond meetings had gone well. You sat down and told me about a reception you had attended at the governor's residence. You described the food, the music." She looked at him with eyes that were clear and dry, and somehow more devastating for it. "You talked for 40 minutes. William felt that land in him like something physical. "And I sat and listened." She picked up her fork again. "Not to eat, just to have something to hold. Because that was what I did. I listened." I smiled. "I asked whether the governor's wife had been pleasant company." A pause. "She had been, apparently." "Abigail, you asked me at the end of the evening whether anything interesting had happened while you were gone." She set the fork down again. "And I looked at you. I thought about the quarantine, and the physician, and the 3 nights I'd spent awake at the Tatum cottage, making sure the baby didn't develop a fever, and I said, nothing much." The weather's been cold. The silence that followed was the heaviest one they had shared yet, and they had shared some considerable silences that day. Why his voice came out rougher than he intended. Why did you say that? Why not just tell me? Because. She looked at him with something almost approaching patience. Because I had told you things before. Smaller things. And you had listened. I could see you listening. I could see you processing the information, and then you had said, or good, or I see, and moved directly on to whatever was next on your mind. And I understood over time that the telling changed nothing, that the information went in and settled somewhere, without weight, without significance, without. She paused. Without you actually understanding that there was a person attached to it. William stared at the candle. He thought about the 40 minutes he'd spent describing a reception at the governor's residence. He thought about his wife sitting across from him, who had spent 6 weeks managing a public health crisis alone, and had answered his eventual question with "the weather's been cold." He thought about the version of himself in that parlor, easy, warm, successful, pleased with how Richmond had gone, and he felt something toward that man that he had not expected. Contempt, not regret, not guilt, which could be managed and processed and eventually set aside. Something sharper. The particular contempt of a person who has seen clearly, for the first time, exactly how small they were in a moment that required them to be large. "I'm sorry." The words were insufficient. He knew they were insufficient. He said them anyway, because not saying them would have been worse. "That is Abigail. I am profoundly sorry." She looked at him steadily. "That's not enough?" "No," she agreed, "it isn't." They sat in the candlelight. The food went mostly untouched. And something shifted between them, not repaired. Nothing so dramatic or easy as that, but shifted. The way a fracture shifts in the ground when the pressure finally releases. It doesn't close the gap, but it stops the active breaking. For tonight, that was something. For tonight, it was everything they had. Then Graves appeared in the doorway. His expression was the kind of carefully neutral that only a very experienced butler can manufacture, and that very neutrality told William immediately that something was wrong. "Forgive the interruption, sir. There is a gentleman at the door. He declined to give his card, but he says the matter is urgent and concerns Lady Harrington directly." William frowned. "Yes, sir." He was quite insistent. Abigail had gone still in a different way than she'd been still before. Not the composed stillness of a woman managing her feelings. Something alert. Something that told William, with the particular perception of a man who was finally paying attention, that she knew who was at the door. "Abigail," her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Have him wait in the front parlor," she said to Graves. "Please." Graves withdrew. William looked at his wife. "Who is it?" A pause, my brother. He had not expected that. The Mercer family, Abigail's family, had been a peripheral presence in their marriage at best. Her parents had died early in their union. She had spoken of her brother rarely, and William had filed him away as a minor character in the broader story of his wife's life without ever inquiring further. "Charles," she said before he could ask. "He's 3 years older than I am. We were close once." She picked up her napkin from her lap and placed it beside her plate. Her movements were deliberate and controlled. "Before I married you." There was something in the way she said "before I married you" that William filed away immediately and painfully. Not an accusation, just a fact, a chronological marker. "Before I married you," as though marrying him had been a kind of dividing line, and everything before it was one country, and everything after it another. "What does he want?" She did not answer immediately. She rose from her chair. She smoothed her dress with the automatic gesture of a woman preparing to walk into a room where she will need to be composed. "I imagine," she said, at last, "that someone told him about the divorce papers." She walked out of the dining room. William sat at the table alone for exactly 4 seconds. Then he followed her. Charles Mercer was standing in the front parlor with his coat still on, and his hat in his hands, and the expression of a man who had ridden hard, and recently there was still road dust on his boots. And his jaw had the set of someone who had been rehearsing an argument for several hours, and was now deciding how to begin it. He was tall like Abigail, with the same dark hair and the same gray eyes. But where her eyes had learned stillness, his were active, restless, the kind of eyes that catalogued a room for threats. When William appeared in the doorway behind Abigail, those eyes locked onto him immediately. They were not warm eyes, William. Charles Mercer's voice was flat and correct. He had the manners of his breeding, and the particular restraint of a man who has decided to stay civil through an act of ongoing will. "Mercer." William inclined his head. I wasn't aware you'd be joining us, a pointed pause. I came to speak with my sister. This is my house. Yes, Charles Mercer agreed pleasantly, with an undertone of steel that William recognized because it was the same undertone he used himself in negotiations. I am aware of that. I am also aware that you have presented my sister with divorce papers, which suggests that your investment in this house may be entering a period of some renegotiation. Charles, Abigail said his name once quietly, in the tone of an older sister who loves her brother and is also thoroughly capable of stopping him. He turned to her. The steel went out of him, not entirely, but partially. What replaced it was something more honest and less armored. Concern. Real, uncomplicated brotherly concern. I came as soon as Cousin Eleanor wrote to me. He took a step toward her. Are you all right? Something moved across Abigail's face that William had not seen all day. Something younger. Something that belonged to the woman she'd been before she became Lady Harrington and started folding her feelings into composure and putting them in boxes. I'm fine, Charles, that is what you always say. He searched her face. And it's never what you mean. She looked at him for a long moment. Then, to William's complete astonishment, her composure cracked not all at once, not dramatically, but in the specific, contained way that a dam develops a fracture. Her eyes went bright and wet, and she pressed her lips together briefly before she controlled it. I know, she said softly. I know it isn't. Charles crossed the room in 3 strides and put his arms around his sister. She let him. She stood in his arms with her hands at her sides for exactly 1 breath, and then her hands came up and gripped the back of his coat, and William watched his wife, the composed, steady, endlessly capable woman, who had not let herself weep through 10 hours of the most significant day of their marriage, pressed against her brother's shoulder, and finally let something out that had clearly been waiting a very long time to be let out. William stood in the doorway of the parlor and felt like an intruder in his own house, because what he was witnessing was not for him. This was what Abigail looked like when she was with someone who had known her before she learned to fold herself away. This was what she looked like when she was safe, genuinely, uncalculatedly safe. And the specific pain of understanding that she had not felt that kind of safe with him, not in years, possibly not ever, settled into William's chest like something permanent. Charles held his sister for a long moment. Then he pulled back and looked at her face with the frank, careful attention of someone who has been watching someone he loves be too strong for too long. Come home, he said, even just for a time. Come home, Abby. She shook her head slightly. I can't. Not yet. She glanced toward the doorway where William stood. Charles followed her gaze, and the look he turned on William was not the polished, controlled expression he'd worn a moment ago. This one was unfiltered. 8 years, he said, not loudly. The quieter version of fury, which is always more dangerous than the loud one. 8 years she has been in this house, and she writes to me maybe 4 times a year, and every letter is about the estate and the tenants and the management of things. And do you know how many times she writes about herself, about what she wants, about whether she is happy? William said nothing. Never. Charles held his gaze. She never writes about that, because she learned somewhere along the way that it wasn't the kind of thing she was allowed to take up space with. He took 1 step closer. I'm going to ask you something, and I need a straight answer. Charles, Abigail began. Have you ever, Charles Mercer said, quietly and precisely, ask my sister what she wants? The question sat in the room. William thought about the unsent letter. I wish you would ask, who are you? What do you want? Are you happy? No, he said. Charles stared at him. Not once, William continued, because the man deserved the complete answer. Not in the way she needed to be asked. I asked about the estate. About social obligations. About things that required her participation. I never asked about her, he paused. I know that. I understood it today, and I have no defense to offer you. The room was very quiet. Charles had clearly prepared for William to defend himself. He had ridden several hours with the argument loaded and ready. The absence of a defense did not disarm him entirely. It was not that simple, but it shifted something in the architecture of his anger. He looked at William with something that was neither forgiving nor its opposite. He turned back to his sister Abby. He said her name the way family does, shortened, shaped by years of use, carrying the specific weight of shared history. If you stay, you need to stay because you have decided to. Not for the estate, not for the name, not because it's the expected thing. He held her gaze. Tell me it's your decision. It's my decision, she said. And if it stops being yours, then I will make a different one. He studied her for another long moment. Then he nodded once. He turned back to William. "I will be in Charleston," he said carefully. "If my sister has need of me." It was a statement. It was also unmistakably a warning, I understand, William said. Charles picked up his hat from the chair where he'd set it. He kissed Abigail's cheek. He walked past William in the doorway, with a half-inch of clearance that was a deliberate choice and not an accident. They heard the front door close. They heard hoofbeats on the drive, moving away. William and Abigail stood in the parlor alone. The candles in here were lower. This room had not been prepared for an evening gathering the way the dining room had. The light was thin and uneven, throwing half of everything into shadow. "He loves you very much," William said. "He always has." She turned to face him. Her eyes were dry again. But they were different eyes than the ones she'd worn through the library, and the bedroom, and the dinner table. Something in them had been cleaned by the crying the way a room feels after a storm passes, clearer than before. "He came to my wedding convinced I was making a mistake. He sat in the front pew and smiled because I wanted him to smile. But he took my hand before I walked in and said," she stopped. Something almost like a smile touched the corner of her mouth. He said, "Tell me now if you're not sure, Abby. No one will be angry." William was quiet. "Were you sure?" She looked at him. "I was sure I loved the man I thought you were." She said it without cruelty. "I was wrong about some of it. I wasn't wrong about all of it." He held that. "What part were you not wrong about?" She tilted her head slightly, thinking, genuinely thinking, not performing consideration. "I believed you could be more than you were allowing yourself to be," she said at last. "I believed there was a man in you who was curious and fair and capable of real attention. I believed the Harrington certainty was something you'd been taught, not something you were born with. And that if someone simply," she paused, "if someone simply refused to let you get away with it, you might surprise yourself." He stared at her. "Is that why you stayed? 8 years of all of it. The work, the box, everything you did without asking for recognition. Is that why?" "Partly." She looked at him honestly. "And partly because I had nowhere else to put myself. I had poured so much into this place, into what it could be, into the people here." She glanced toward the window, toward the dark estate beyond it. "Leaving would have felt like abandoning them, and I was not willing to do that. But you're willing now." A pause. "I was willing this morning," she said carefully. "I'm less certain this evening, and I don't know what I'll be tomorrow." She held his gaze. "That is the most honest thing I can tell you." "That's enough." He meant it. "That's more than enough." They were standing close, not touching, but closer than they had been at any point that day. The distance between them had been physical all day, maintained deliberately by both of them. A kind of unconscious agreement that they needed the space. But the parlor was smaller than the library and the dining room and the bedroom hallway, and proximity had happened without either of them planning it. William could see this close, the tiredness in her face. Not just today's tiredness, the accumulated tiredness of 8 years of managing things alone, of carrying a household and an estate and her own silence, and never once being given permission to set any of it down. He had done that to her. He had not meant to. He was beginning to understand that not meaning to was not the same as not doing it. "You should rest," he said. "Today has been," he stopped, because there was no word adequate for what today had been. "Yes." She stepped back small, measured, the unconscious recalibration of a woman maintaining her own space. She moved toward the door. She paused. She turned back to him with the expression of a woman who has decided to say something she has been holding for a very long time, and who has decided for reasons of her own that tonight is the night to say it. "There is one more thing in the box," she said. "At the very bottom. Under the papers," he frowned. "I read everything." "Not everything." A pause. "There is a small photograph. Wrapped in cloth." Another pause. "Open it carefully." She walked out of the parlor. He heard her go up the stairs. He stood in the parlor for 1 full minute. Then he walked to the library. He went to the box. He looked at the bottom. The papers were stacked back in it, somewhat less neatly than they'd been before, from his hours of reading. He lifted them out carefully, setting them to the side. And there, at the very base of the box, he found it. A small square wrapped in a piece of soft blue cloth, the same dark blue as the dress Abigail had been wearing that morning. He unwrapped it. It was not a photograph. Photographs barely existed in 1817, and what existed was too fragile and too rare for the common pocket. It was a miniature portrait painted on ivory, small enough to fit in a palm, the kind of thing that was made to be carried close. The woman in the portrait was young, dark hair, gray eyes, serious expression, but she was laughing. He had not seen Abigail's face in a full, genuine laugh in years. He had not realized how long until he looked at this portrait and recognized the laugh, and could not remember the last time it had been real. On the back of the ivory, in handwriting he did not recognize, not Abigail's script, were 4 words. Small, careful. Remember who she is. He turned it over. Looked at the laughing face. He had no idea whose writing was on the back. He had no idea when the portrait had been made, or who had added those words, or why it had been placed at the bottom of the box, beneath all those years of documents and letters and records. He only knew that it had been put there intentionally. And he knew in the way he knew things now, that he was finally paying attention, that it was meant for him. Remember who she is, not who she is to you, not what she does for you. Not what she manages and maintains and holds together so quietly that you can pretend the house runs itself. Who she is. The woman who laughs. The woman who knocks on a tenant's door in the cold. The woman who teaches housemaids to read accounts because she believes every woman deserves to understand how money moves. The woman who writes 17-page plans and hands them to someone else without putting her name on them because she has learned, over years, that namelessness is the price of implementation. The woman who wrote a letter and never sent it because she already knew it would not reach him. The woman who stayed. William Harrington sat down on the floor of his library, not in a chair, not behind his desk on the floor, with the miniature portrait in his hands and the open box beside him, and 8 years of his wife's hidden life spread around him, and he understood something that no document or letter or testimony from any tenant or schoolmistress or estate manager could have told him. She had not merely worked for this estate. She had loved it. She had loved it the way people love things they choose, not things they inherit, not things they're given, but things they decide, every single day, to pour themselves into. She had loved this estate. She had loved the man she believed he could become. And he had spent 8 years being too certain to notice. He closed his hand around the portrait. He pressed it flat against his chest. And for the first time in his adult life, William Harrington, a man who had never once questioned the rightness of his own position in the world, sat in the silence of everything he had failed to see, and let it break him fully. Because some things need to break completely before anything true can begin. Part 4. The man who finally saw her. He slept on the library floor. Not by drama. He simply did not get up. At some point the candles burned down, and the room went dark around him, and he stayed where he was, on the floor with his back against the foot of the leather chair and the miniature portrait still in his hand. And eventually exhaustion pulled him under in the way that a long day of breaking open tends to do. When he woke, it was early, the kind of early that has no color yet gray and cool and completely silent except for the first birds, tentative and distant, somewhere in the trees beyond the house. He sat up slowly. His back ached, his neck ached. His eyes felt the particular rawness of someone who has spent a long day reading things that cost him something. He looked down at the portrait in his hand. She was still laughing. He stood up. He went upstairs, washed, changed his clothes. He did not ring for his valet. It felt wrong this morning to be waited on to have someone else manage the small details of his own body while his wife was 2 doors down the hall in a room with an open traveling trunk, deciding what her life was going to be. He dressed himself quietly in the gray pre-dawn, and then he went back downstairs and did something he had not done in years. He went to the kitchen, not to give instructions, not to review the household accounts or speak with the cook about the week's provisions. He went to the kitchen because it was where the house woke up first, and because he had a sudden, urgent need to see the house as it actually was, not as it presented itself to him, managed and arranged and smoothed over by the invisible hands of the people who kept it running. The cook, Mrs. Price, was already there when he arrived. She was a stout, practical woman of 55 who had been at Harrington Manor for 12 years, and who had the particular unflappability of someone who has seen most things and concluded that very little of it warrants panic. She looked up from the stove when William appeared in the doorway and went completely still for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to register genuine surprise before she recovered herself. My lord, no curtsy. She had flour on her hands and a pot on the fire, and she was clearly doing 3 things at once. You're up early, sir. I am. He came into the kitchen. Mrs. Price, I've been told. He paused. I understand that Lady Harrington taught you to read the household accounts. The cook looked at him steadily. She did, sir. 3 of us. What else did she teach you? That question sat differently in the kitchen than it would have in the library. Mrs. Price studied him with Frank, who spent 12 years watching us household from its working center, and who has seen exactly how things run, and who runs them. She taught me to negotiate with the meat supplier, she said at last, because she said the man was overcharging by 12%, and I was in a better position to catch it than anyone else, being the one who places the order. A pause. She was right. I've saved the household $40 in the last 2 years on meat alone. William absorbed that. She taught Nettie to read the seed catalogs, Mrs. Price continued, warming slightly, as people do when they realize they are being genuinely listened to. So Nettie could order directly and make sure the garden got what it needed without going through Mr. Harlow every time, because Mr. Harlow doesn't know the difference between a kitchen garden and a decorative one, and Lady Abigail said that was nobody's fault, but it meant Nettie was the better person to manage it. And the girl in the hallway, William said, reading the accounts. Clara. Yes, sir. Lady Abigail, said Mrs. Price, stopped herself slightly. The way people do when they're about to repeat something they weren't sure the listener wanted to hear. Then she looked at William's face and apparently decided he did. Lady Abigail said that a woman who understands money is a woman who can make her own choices, and that every woman in this house deserved the chance to make her own choices. William stood in the kitchen. He thought about the 17-page land management plan. He thought about the drainage rerouting, and the labor dispute, and the Caldwell precedent, and the schoolmistress's roof. He thought about a woman who had spent 8 years quietly building not just the estate, not just the finances, not just the systems and records and negotiations, but the people around her, teaching them, equipping them, making sure that when she left, and she had always known, he understood now, she had always known she might leave, the people she had cared about would still be able to stand. She had been preparing to go for years, and in that preparation, she had built a legacy inside this house that had nothing to do with his name. He thanked Mrs. Price. He went back upstairs. He knocked on Abigail's door. Silence, then movement, then her voice, still carrying the slight roughness of recent sleep. One moment. He waited in the hallway. The door opened. She was dressed, not formally, but dressed. She had been up before him, it seemed, or had risen at the sound of his knock. Her hair was down, which he realized he almost never saw. It fell past her shoulders, dark and uncombed. She looked younger with her hair down. She looked like the woman in the miniature portrait. She looked at him with clear, careful eyes. No composure performance this early. It was too early for that. And perhaps something had shifted enough in the night that the performance felt less necessary. You slept in your clothes, she said, looking at him. He glanced down. He had changed, but apparently not as thoroughly as he'd thought. I slept on the library floor. She stared at him. Why I didn't get up. He met her eyes. I found the portrait. She went still. I want to know whose handwriting is on the back, he said. The 4 words. Remember who she is. Who wrote that? A long pause. My mother, she said at last. She gave it to me the morning of our wedding. Abigail looked at the portrait in his hand. He was still carrying it. Had carried it upstairs without thinking. She said to keep it somewhere safe. Somewhere I could find it when I forgot. Forgot what? Her eyes came back to his face. Who I was before I became what someone else needed me to be. He looked down at the laughing face in the portrait. Her mother had given her this. On her wedding morning, had looked at her daughter and seen, with the particular clear sight of a woman who has lived long enough to know how marriages work, that the girl she was handing to the world might need a reminder someday, at some point, when the years had done their usual work, that she existed independent of the man she was marrying. She knew, William said. Mothers usually do. No bitterness in it. Just fact. He held the portrait out to her. She looked at it in his hand for a moment. Then she took it, Abigail. He waited until she met his eyes. I want to start over. The look she gave him then was complicated and honest and contained about 15 different things at once. He was learning to read her face, or beginning to learn. Which was not the same thing, but was the necessary first step. You can't start over, she said. Nobody can. You can only go forward. Then I want to go forward differently. I know. She held the portrait in both hands, looking down at it. I know you do. A pause. But wanting differently and being different are, she searched for the right word. They are not the same country, William. And I have been given promises before that turned out to be wanting. He heard that. He didn't flinch from it. Then I won't promise, he said. I'll show you. She looked up at him. Neither of them spoke. Down the hallway, a clock chimed the half hour. 6:30 in the morning. The first real light began to come through the window at the end of the hall, pale gold and tentative. "I'm going to the village today," she said at last. "I have a standing arrangement with Miss Parrish on Fridays. The older children are working through some difficulty with arithmetic, and I promised I'd come." He held very still. "May I come with you?" The surprise on her face was swift and unguarded. "You want to come to the schoolroom, yes. To watch children do arithmetic. To be somewhere you are," he said simply, "if that's permitted." She studied him for a long, careful moment. He did not fill the silence. He was learning that too. "All right," she said at last. "Give me an hour." He nodded. He turned to go back downstairs. "William," her voice stopped him. He turned. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't fully read, cautious, searching. The expression of a woman who has been disappointed enough times to move carefully toward hope, the way you move carefully on ice. "Eat something," she said. "Mrs. Price will have breakfast ready. You look like you haven't eaten since yesterday morning." He almost smiled. "I haven't." She pointed toward the staircase with the specific authority of a woman who has been managing a household for 8 years and knows exactly how things get done. He went, and for the first time in he could not say how long, William Harrington went downstairs and ate his breakfast and felt something he did not immediately recognize because it had been absent long enough to become unfamiliar. He felt present, simply entirely in the room present. It was not a comfortable feeling. It was in fact much harder than the numb competence he'd been maintaining for years. But it was real in a way that the other thing had not been. He ate. He waited. She came downstairs at 7:15 in her practical coat and her sensible boots and her hair pinned simply, the way she always wore it. And she said, "Ready?" And he stood up and said, "Yes." And they walked out together into the first clear morning the county had seen in 4 days, the sky washed clean by all that rain, the fields bright and dripping. And William Harrington walked beside his wife toward the village and paid attention to every single thing she did. The schoolroom was a modest building at the edge of the village, not the most impressive structure. But with the new roof that Abigail had secretly funded 3 years ago, it was dry and solid and warm. Miss Parrish was a thin, sharp-eyed woman of 40, who greeted Abigail with the warm directness of genuine affection, and then turned that sharp gaze on William with the frank assessment of someone who has spent her adult life sizing up people and has no particular patience for pretension. Lord Harrington. Not cold, not warm. Neutral. Miss Parrish, he inclined his head. "I understand I owe you a roof." Her eyes widened slightly. Then she looked at Abigail. Abigail was looking at a small boy near the window who was arguing with his slate in the way that small boys do when the numbers won't cooperate. She appeared, entirely convincingly, not to be listening. Miss Parrish looked back at William. "Technically," she said at last, "you owe Lady Harrington a roof. She paid for it." "Yes," he held her gaze, "I know that now." Another long look. Then something shifted in the schoolmistress's expression. Subtle, reluctant, the specific adjustment of a woman who has decided to give someone the benefit of a doubt she had not previously intended to extend. "The children are working on long division," she said. "If you intend to stay, you'll need to make yourself useful." He stayed for 2 hours. He did not make speeches. He did not announce himself. He sat at the back of the room and watched his wife move among the children, patient, direct, funny in the dry, precise way of someone who respects a child's intelligence, and he learned more about her in those 2 hours than he had learned in years of sharing a house with her. She knew the children by name, not just their names, their situations. She knew which boy was struggling because his father had been ill, and he'd been helping at home instead of coming to school. She knew which girl was sharp as a blade, but afraid to show it in front of the boys. She spoke to the afraid girl differently than she spoke to the others. Not with special gentleness, but with specific, deliberate respect, calling on her first, taking her answers seriously, creating, without announcing that she was doing it, a small pocket of safety where the girl could be exactly as smart as she actually was. William watched this. He thought about how many rooms he had sat in where the smartest person present did not say much because there was no pocket of safety. He thought about how many years he had sat in those rooms without noticing. He thought about whether he had created those rooms, and knew, with the flat honesty that the past 24 hours had stripped him down to, that he probably had. Probably more than once. Probably more than he would ever know. When they left the schoolroom, Miss Parrish walked them to the door. At the threshold, she looked at William directly and said, "She's done more for this village than 3 generations of Harrington men combined. I say that as a statement of fact and not as an insult. I understand that, William said. I'm beginning to understand a great many things. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded, short, decisive, and went back inside. They walked back through the village toward the estate. The morning was fully established now, the gold light hardening into the clear white of a bright day after rain. People they passed nodded to Abigail with the particular warmth that comes from actual relationship, not sole obligation. A woman selling bread called out her name. An old man tipped his hat. Two children who had clearly been in the schoolroom ran past them on the road, and the girl, the afraid girl who was sharp as a blade, turned back to wave specifically at Abigail, a wide, uncomplicated wave. And Abigail lifted her hand and waved back, and the smile on her face was the smile from the portrait. William saw it. He kept walking, but he kept it. They were halfway back to the estate when Abigail said, without looking at him, "You were watching me the entire time." "Yes, it's unsettling. I imagine it is." A pause. "I'm sorry, I won't stop." She glanced at him sideways. "That's a peculiar apology. It's not an apology. It's a statement of intent." He looked at her. "I have been not watching you for 8 years. I intend to correct that. I expect it will take some getting used to on both sides." She was quiet for a moment. Then very briefly, the corner of her mouth lifted. It was not the full laugh from the portrait, but it was something. It was the beginning of something. They came back to the estate at mid-morning. Harlow was waiting at the gate with the expression of a man who has something to report and is not certain how it will be received. He looked between William and Abigail with careful eyes and then addressed himself to William. "Sir, there's a letter arrived this morning. From Charleston. From the Aldrich Group." William recognized the name. A consortium of investors, wealthy men, old money, the kind of people whose interest in an estate like Harrington Manor could mean significant opportunity or significant complication, depending on the nature of the interest. "What do they want?" "They want a meeting, sir, regarding the eastern acreage." Harlow paused. "They've made inquiries about purchase." William went still. He turned to look at Abigail. She was looking at Harlow, her expression careful and controlled, but her eyes had changed. The eastern acreage was the parcel she had defended in the Caldwell dispute, the boundary argument that had been won on the precedent she'd quietly researched and handed to Renner. It was also, he knew from the box, the acreage she had proposed expanding into orchard use in her 17-page plan. The plan that had increased the estate's long-term agricultural value by a margin that Harlow had confirmed yesterday was significant. The Aldrich Group wanted to buy the land that Abigail had spent years developing. When William's voice was level, "They propose next Thursday, sir. In Charleston." "Right back," William said. "Tell them I'll meet them." "And tell them," he paused. He looked at Abigail. "Tell them that Lady Harrington will be attending as well, in her capacity as the primary architect of the estate's agricultural development." Harlow blinked. Abigail turned to look at William. "Her capacity," Harlow began. "That is the accurate description," William said. "It is what she is. Write it that way." Harlow looked at Abigail, who was looking at William with an expression that he was beginning to learn to read, and which right now said clearly, unmistakably, that she had not expected that. "Yes, sir," Harlow said, and withdrew. They stood in the gate. "You didn't ask me," Abigail said. "I should have asked you." He turned to face her fully. "Do you want to come?" The question, simple, direct, preceded by the acknowledgement that he should have asked, first landed differently than it would have 24 hours ago. She heard the difference. He could see that she heard it. "Yes," she said, "I want to come." He nodded. They went inside. The rest of that day was quieter than the day before, but it had a different quality, not the silence of two people avoiding, but the silence of two people who are occupying the same space and choosing not to fill it with noise for its own sake. William worked at his desk. Abigail worked at hers. She had her own writing desk in the sitting room adjacent to the library, and she sat there through the afternoon reviewing correspondence he would previously have known nothing about. At one point he appeared in the doorway and asked if she needed anything, and she said, "The estate accounts for last quarter, if you have them," and he went and got them and set them on the edge of her desk and went back to his own work. Small things, entirely ordinary, domestic small things. But they were not the same small things as before. Because before they had been small things performed by people who shared a house. These were small things performed by people who were learning carefully, slowly, without promises to share a life. That evening at dinner, she asked about the Aldrich Group, not with the careful, neutral tone of a woman asking about a social obligation. With genuine investment, She asked specific questions about their portfolio, their history with similar estates, what she suspected their actual interest in the acreage was. She had clearly been thinking about it all afternoon. He answered every question as fully as he could. When he didn't know something, he said he didn't know instead of deflecting. And for the first time in 8 years, dinner lasted 3 hours. Not because they ran out of things to say, because they kept finding new things. She had opinions about the Aldrich Group that were sharper and more specific than his own. She had done this. She had clearly sat with the information for half a day and thought it through with the same rigor she brought to everything, and she laid out her analysis without performance, directly and confidently, the way she might have spoken if she had ever believed he was genuinely listening. He took notes. She noticed him taking notes. She stopped speaking mid-sentence. "You're writing down what I'm saying." "Yes, why?" He looked up at her. "Because you're right about the Aldrich Group, and I don't want to lose the specifics." She stared at him. He looked back at his notes. "Abigail," he set the pen down. "I want to say something, and I need you to hear it as a statement and not as a promise, because I told you I would show you rather than promise you. And I intend to keep that." She waited. "I am going to spend the rest of whatever time you give me being a different man than I was yesterday." He held her gaze. "Not because I think it will fix what I broke. Not because I think it earns me anything. But because," he paused, found the words, "because you were right. You were right about all of it. And I am done being the man who was wrong." Her eyes held his. "That will take a long time," she said quietly. "Yes, and there will be days you fail at it. Yes. And I will notice, I know." He held her gaze without flinching. "I'm counting on it." Something passed across her face. Not the guarded composure, not the careful neutrality she had maintained through all of yesterday. Something underneath those things, something older and more genuine, the specific expression of a woman who is trying very hard not to hope and is losing the battle with herself. She looked down at the dinner table. "Charles will want a report," she said at last. "He'll write me next week to make sure I haven't done something foolish." "What will you tell him?" A long pause. "I'll tell him I'm staying." She looked up. "For now, not forever, not a declaration, not the closing of a wound. 2 words that meant I am still here. I am still watching. I have not decided to trust you, but I have decided not to leave today." For a man who had spent 8 years taking permanence for granted, those 2 words were a gift he had not earned and knew it. "Thank you," he said. She reached across the table. Not to take his hand, she was not there yet, and he did not expect it, and he did not reach for hers. But she reached across the table and picked up the pen he had set down and handed it back to him. "Finish your notes," she said. "The section about Aldrich's previous acquisition in Georgia, that's the most important part." He took the pen, he wrote, and she talked, and he listened, truly, entirely, with no part of his attention elsewhere, no corner of his mind reserved for whatever came next, and it was the most alive he had felt at that table in 8 years. But the night was not finished with them yet. At 9:30, just as they were preparing to leave the table, Graves appeared in the doorway with an envelope and an expression that William had learned, over 30 years of living with this man, meant significant news. "A letter arrived by express rider, sir, from your solicitor in Charleston." William took it. He recognized Renner's seal. He broke it. He read. He went completely still. Abigail watched his face change. She had been watching his face all evening, learning the new vocabulary of it, the small shifts that showed what he actually felt rather than what he had decided to present. And what she saw now was not the practiced stillness of before. It was something sharp and real. "What is it?" He looked up from the letter. "It's from Renner." His voice was level, but only barely. "He writes to inform me that a deed claim has been filed against the eastern acreage." She straightened. "Filed by whom?" "By a man named Grafton." He watched the recognition cross her face, sudden, swift, and not surprised. "Abigail, do you know that name?" She was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds that told him everything. "Grafton was one of the workers I dismissed," she said carefully. "In 1814, he was falsifying the harvest records on the eastern farm, taking additional grain and selling it privately. He was dismissed." She held his gaze. "Without telling you, because at the time the situation needed to be handled immediately, and you were in Richmond and—" "I know why you didn't tell me." He was already folding the letter, already on his feet. "The deed claim, what grounds does he have?" "None that are legitimate." Her voice was steady, but her jaw was tight, unless she stopped. "Then," he claimed, "when I dismissed him, that he had a prior agreement with your father's estate manager." A verbal agreement about a parcel of land on the eastern boundary. I didn't believe it. I dismissed it because there was no written record and the man was a proven thief. But if he fabricated a record, or found someone to swear to the verbal agreement. Her eyes were sharp and focused, and the composure was fully gone now, replaced by something more useful, more direct. She was thinking, working the problem in real time, the way she had been working problems for 8 years alone. We need to see what was filed. We need to talk to Renner. And she paused. There is a woman in the village. Margaret Fulshi. She was on the eastern farm in your father's time. She knew every agreement, verbal or otherwise, because she kept the informal records when the estate manager was ill. She'll know if Grafton's claim has any basis. William looked at his wife. She had already assembled the response. Before he had finished processing the problem, she had mapped the resources, identified the witness, and outlined the necessary steps. He had spent 8 years in rooms full of men who had done exactly this, laid out the problem, proposed the response, moved decisively forward. And he had called it leadership and prized it and rewarded it. His wife did it every day, and he had called it nothing at all. Come with me to Charleston on Thursday, he said. Not just for the Aldrich meeting, for Renner. I want you in the room. I was already planning to be in the room. He stopped. For the Aldrich meeting. Yes, she clarified. You invited me. But for the Renner meeting, I would have found a way to be there regardless. A pause. This is my estate too, William. It has been for 8 years. Whether or not my name appears on the deed. He looked at her for a long moment. It should appear on the deed, he said. She stared at him. I want to speak to Renner about that as well. His voice was steady. He had made up his mind in the space of one breath, and he knew, with the specific clarity of a decision that is right, that it would not change. Whatever legal arrangement is possible, partnership, co-stewardship, whatever Renner advises, I want your name on the documentation of this estate. Abigail sat very still. Why? The word came out quieter than she intended. He could hear it, the slight catch of someone who has been surprised into sincerity. Because your work is in every acre of it. He held her gaze. Because your name should have been there from the beginning. Because he stopped, found the core of it. Because you are not support staff. You are this estate's foundation. And it is long past time the paperwork reflected what is actually true. The candlelight moved between them. Outside the night was completely still, no rain, no wind, just the deep quiet of a country dark that has nothing left to prove. Abigail sat across the table from her husband. She looked at him, and something in her face, something she had been holding very carefully closed for a very long time, opened. Not all the way, not yet. There was still such ground to cross, so much trust to rebuild, so many ordinary days ahead of testing and watching and choosing and risking. But something opened. She reached across the table. And this time she took his hand. Her grip was firm, not tentative. The grip of a woman who, when she decides to hold something, holds it. One step at a time, she said. His hand closed around hers. One step at a time, he agreed. They sat like that for a long moment, two people who had spent 8 years in the same house, and were finally at last in the same room. Then she released his hand. She straightened in her chair. We should write to Margaret Fulshi tonight, she said. Already practical, already solving. The sooner she knows we need her, the better. He pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. Tell me what to say, he said. And this time, for the first time, he meant it entirely. Part 5. The love he could never take for granted again. The letter to Margaret Fulshi went out before 10 o'clock that night. Abigail wrote it herself, not because William offered poorly, but because she knew the woman. She knew how to write to her. She knew that Margaret Fulshi was 73 years old. And had lived her entire life in this county, and had a deep, bone-level suspicion of anything that smelled like a legal maneuver, and so the letter needed to come from someone she trusted rather than from the lord of an estate with a solicitor's problem. William watched her write it. He did not hover, he did not suggest. He sat at his own side of the table and read back through Renner's letter and let her work, because he was learning 1 hour at a time the difference between being present and being in the way. When she finished, she read it back silently, made one small correction, and folded it. She'll come, Abigail said. She doesn't like Grafton. She never did. You remember that after 3 years? I remember everything about the people on this estate. She looked at him without accusation. Simply as a fact. That's what it means to actually know them. He nodded. He felt that. He received it without defending himself against it. That, too, was new. The letter went out with a writer that night. By the next morning, Margaret Fulshi had sent word back. She would come to the estate on Tuesday. She had information, she wrote, in the uneven hand of a woman who had not needed to write much in recent years, but who clearly had something to say. She had information that she had been waiting for someone to ask about. William read that line twice, waiting for someone to ask. He thought about how many people in his life had been waiting for someone to ask. He thought about how long the asking had taken. Tuesday came with a cold clarity, the kind of autumn morning that has made up its mind about the season and intends to be brisk about it. Margaret Fulshie arrived at the estate just after breakfast, escorted by her granddaughter, who was young and watchful and held the old woman's arm with a practiced protectiveness that suggested she had done this many times. William met them at the door himself, no graves, no formality. He opened the door and stepped back and said, "Mrs. Fulshie, thank you for coming." The old woman looked at him with 73 years of accumulated discernment. She was small, white-haired, with the kind of face that has done so much living that every feeling that crosses it has depth behind it. "Lord Harrington." She stepped inside. Then she looked past him and saw Abigail coming down the hallway, and her entire expression changed. She opened her arms, and Abigail walked into them, the same way she had walked into her brother's arms, with the particular relief of a person arriving at something safe. "My girl," Margaret Fulshie said quietly, over Abigail's shoulder, and held her for a long moment. William stood to the side. He was getting better at standing to the side. They gathered in the library, the same library where 3 days ago everything had broken open. William had spent a portion of the previous day straightening it, returning Abigail's documents to the box, placing the box on the shelf where it belonged. He had also, in a gesture that was small but deliberate, moved his own chair 6 inches back from the desk, so that hers no longer seemed to be across from him but beside him. She had noticed. She hadn't said anything, but she had noticed. Margaret Fulshie settled herself in one of the wing chairs and looked at both of them with those clear, deep eyes. "You want to know about Grafton," she said. "Not a question." "We want to know everything you know," Abigail said. "Whatever you've been waiting to tell someone." The old woman was quiet for a moment. Then she folded her hands in her lap. "Grafton came to me," she began, 2 weeks ago, before the deed claim was filed. He came to my door and asked me to sign a statement saying I had witnessed a verbal agreement between himself and old Mr. Cheswick, that was your father's estate manager, my lord, regarding a portion of the eastern boundary parcel. William leaned forward slightly. "And had you witnessed such an agreement?" "I had witnessed a conversation." Her voice was careful, precise. The precision of a woman who understands the difference between what she saw and what someone wants her to say she saw. Cheswick and Grafton spoke in the yard about the possibility of Grafton taking over the lease on the easternmost strip. Possibility, nothing agreed, nothing promised. Cheswick died that same winter and nothing ever came of it. But Grafton wants you to say it was an agreement. He wants me to say it was a firm promise. That Cheswick all but gave him the land. She pressed her lips flat. I told him I would not lie. He left, a pause. 3 days later a man came back, not Grafton, someone I didn't know, and offered me money. The room went very still. How much? William's voice was level. More than I've seen in a long time. The old woman looked at him without flinching. I told him to get off my property. William looked at Abigail. Abigail was looking at Margaret Fulshie with an expression that combined deep respect and deep concern. "You should have written to me immediately," she said quietly. "When Grafton first came, I didn't want to trouble you." The old woman's voice softened. "I heard through the village, the way things move through a village, that things here were not settled. I didn't know if," she paused delicately. "I didn't know what the situation was." "The situation," Abigail said with a clarity that carried weight in every direction at once, "is that this is still my estate. Whatever else may be uncertain." The words landed in the room. William absorbed them. She had said my estate, not our estate. Not Lord Harrington's estate, my estate. And he did not correct her. Because she was right. Because it was Mrs. Fulshie. William said, "Would you be willing to provide a sworn statement to our solicitor in Charleston, stating precisely what you saw, a conversation, not an agreement, and what Grafton and his associates subsequently asked of you?" "I would. No hesitation. I've been wanting to say it somewhere official since the man showed up at my door. Then I will arrange for Renner to come to you, if you prefer not to travel to Charleston. Whatever is most convenient." The old woman looked at him for a moment. Then she turned to Abigail. Something passed between them, the particular silent communication of two women who understand each other without requiring language. "He's different," Margaret Full said to Abigail. Directly, as though William were not sitting 4 feet away. Abigail held the old woman's gaze. "He's trying to be." "Trying counts," Margaret Fulshie said. "At my age, I've learned that trying is most of it." She pushed herself up from the chair with her granddaughter's help. "Send your solicitor to me, Lord Harrington. I'll tell him everything." She left. The granddaughter cast one quick, curious look at William, on the way out the look of a young woman filing away information about powerful people, storing it for the future, and then the door closed, and the library was quiet again. Abigail stood. She walked to the window. Outside he could hear it without seeing it. The particular quality of morning moving into afternoon, the estate sounds that were as familiar to him as breathing, but which he had never truly listened to before outside. The world was going on. Workers in the fields, horses in the paddock, the distant sound of children on the road. His estate. Her estate. The estate that she had spent 8 years holding together with her mind and her hands, and the specific tireless grace of a woman who gives herself to something and means it. "We need to go to Charleston Thursday regardless," she said without turning from the window. Even with Margaret's statement, Renner needs to move quickly on the deed claim before it goes to formal hearing. "I know," and the Aldrich meeting she turned. "William, I want to be clear about something before we walk into that room." He waited. "I am not coming as your wife." Her voice was even and direct. "I am coming as the person who developed the eastern acreage's agricultural value. If they want to discuss that land, they will discuss it with me. And if they attempt, at any point, to address their questions exclusively to you while I am sitting at the same table, I'll redirect them," he said. She stopped. He held her gaze. "Every time. Without exception. For as long as it takes until they understand who they're actually talking to." She looked at him. She had the expression again, the one he was beginning to recognize, the expression of a woman fighting a battle with her own hope. The hope was winning today, he could see it. "All right," she said. "All right," he agreed. They went to Charleston on Thursday. The ride was 4 hours, and they spent it in a way that would have been unrecognizable to either of them 1 week ago, talking. Not the careful, managed exchanges of two people sharing domestic information, actually talking. She told him about a book she had been reading, a natural philosophy text she had borrowed from Miss Pruss, and she laid out the author's argument with the comfortable confidence of someone who had thought about it for weeks. He pushed back on one point genuinely, not to assert himself, but because he found a real counter-argument, and she considered it, and then dismantled it so thoroughly that he laughed. He laughed. She looked at him when he laughed, surprised, then something softer. "You should do that more," she said. "Lose arguments? Laugh." A pause. "You used to laugh more easily when we first met." He thought about that. "I became certain," he said at last. "The way you said. And certain men stop laughing because everything is either right or wrong, and neither is particularly funny." She tilted her head slightly. "What changed it? This week, I mean. What actually changed it?" He thought about the right answer. "Not the impressive one, the true one, the floor," he said. She waited. "I slept on the library floor with your mother's portrait in my hand, and I woke up with a sore back and an understanding that I had been wrong about nearly everything." He held her gaze across the carriage. "There is something clarifying about a cold floor." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she laughed. It was not the full laugh from the portrait, not quite, not yet. But it was real, and it was warm, and it filled the carriage with something that had been absent from any space they had shared in years. He kept it. He put it somewhere careful. Renner met them at his offices in Charleston with the focused energy of a man who has a significant problem and a clear plan for solving it. He was a careful, intelligent man who had, William now understood, been carrying a secret, Abigail's secret, the Caldwell precedent, for over a year, and the relief of not carrying it anymore had made him somewhat more direct than he might otherwise have been. He shook William's hand. He turned to Abigail and shook her hand too, not the brief, deferential acknowledgement that men of his profession typically offered women, but a firm, genuine handshake. "Lady Harrington, I am very glad you're here." "You should have told him sooner," she said, directly but without rancor. "I know." He didn't offer an excuse. "I thought I was protecting what you'd built." "I may have been protecting the wrong thing." She looked at him steadily. "Yes, but you protected it well. That matters too." Renner nodded. He set out the papers on the desk. He laid out the Grafton deed claim, the timeline of events, the witness situation. He paused at one specific document. "The claim relies primarily on the alleged verbal agreement with Cheswick. But there is a secondary element." He looked up. Grafton has found a man, a former laborer who worked the Eastern Farm briefly in 1812, who is prepared to testify that he also witnessed the conversation. Abigail's expression shifted. Who is the man? Renner checked his notes. A Thomas Birch. He was dismissed in 1812, she said immediately. Also for record falsification, he and Grafton worked together. Same operation, I dismissed them both, but separately, a month apart. Renner stared at her. You're certain? I have the records. She looked at William. They're at the estate. I can have them sent by express rider by tomorrow morning. Renner looked at William. William looked at Abigail. Send for them now, William said. She stood, crossed to Renner's writing desk without being invited, and wrote the instruction herself in the quick, precise hand that had filled 17 pages of land management plans and unsent letters and records of everything that mattered. She handed it to Renner's clerk at the door. Renner watched all of this with the expression of a man recalibrating something significant. The records will invalidate Birch as a credible witness, Abigail said, returning to her chair. A man dismissed for falsification cannot credibly testify to the authenticity of a business agreement. She looked at Renner. Combined with Margaret Fulshie's statement about the nature of the original conversation, the claim should fail at preliminary hearing. I believe it will, Renner agreed, provided, he paused. Provided we move before Grafton finds a third witness. He has resources behind him, the Aldrich Group. The Aldrich Group is behind this. William's voice sharpened. Renner was quiet for exactly one beat. I believe so, yes. I could not say it with certainty last week. I can say it with more certainty now. He looked at both of them. The deed claim and the purchase inquiry arrived within 48 hours of each other. That is not coincidence. William turned to Abigail. She was already thinking. He could see it in her face, the rapid, organized processing of a woman who has learned to work 3 steps ahead of every problem she has ever faced. They want to destabilize the ownership question, she said. If the deed claim creates enough uncertainty about the eastern boundary, it weakens our position in the Aldrich meeting. They come in as the solution offer to buy the disputed acreage at reduced value while the claim is pending. And if we need cash to defend the legal challenge, William understood where she was going. We might be tempted to accept less than the land is worth just to resolve the problem quickly. She looked at Renner. That is what they're counting on. Renner nodded slowly. It's an intelligent scheme, it is, she agreed. But it only works if we don't see it coming. The 3 of them sat with that for a moment. Then William said, cancel the Aldrich meeting. Abigail turned to look at him. Cancel it entirely, he continued. Don't postpone. Cancel. If they're behind the deed claim, the meeting was never about a fair purchase offer. It was a pressure play. He held her gaze. And I don't respond to pressure by negotiating. Something moved across Abigail's face. The recognition of a quality she had been told was in him, that the Harrington certainty could be something other than blindness, that under the right conditions, it could become actual backbone. Send a letter today, she said to Renner. Regrets, no reason given. Lord and Lady Harrington are unavailable. Renner looked at William. William nodded once. Renner began writing. The Aldrich meeting was cancelled before noon. By 3 o'clock, Renner had drafted the preliminary response to the deed claim, incorporating Margaret Fulshie's forthcoming statement, and the anticipated arrival of the dismissal records for Grafton and Birch. He was confident, he said, in their position. He would not go so far as to call it resolved, but he called it strong. They left his offices in the late afternoon. They had dinner in Charleston, a quiet restaurant, not the kind of establishment where William Harrington would typically be seen, not the sort of place designed to impress, but the sort of place where the food was good and the tables had enough space between them that 2 people could actually hear each other think. She ordered for herself. He noticed that he had never seen her do that in public. Before, she had always deferred to him, waited for him to order first, followed his lead even in the selection of her own meal. Small thing, enormous thing. You knew about the Aldrich connection, he said, midway through the meal. Before Renner told us. She didn't deny it, I suspected. The timing was too clean. When did you work it out? The night the letter arrived. She looked at him across the table. When you read the letter, and your face changed, I'd already had half the evening to think about why someone would file a deed claim against that specific parcel, that specific week. There is only one party with both the motive and the resources. And you didn't say anything. I was waiting to see if you would see it yourself. A pause. You did in Renner's office before I said it.
He sat with that.
She had been testing him. Not unkindly, not manipulatively, but the way anyone who has been let down many times will quietly test whether something has genuinely changed before they stake too much on it. She had sat in Renner's office with the full picture already assembled in her mind, and she had waited to see if he could get there himself. He had. "I'm not going to pretend that doesn't feel like a test," he said. It was. She met his eyes without apology. "I told you there would be days you failed at it. I also need to know when you don't fare." He held her gaze. "I intend to keep passing." The corner of her mouth lifted. They came home late. The house was quiet, the particular quiet of a household that has gone to bed and left lamps burning for the people expected back. At the foot of the stairs, Abigail paused. She had been pausing at thresholds all week, not from hesitation, from choosing, from making each decision deliberately, rather than moving through the world on habit and obligation. "William." She turned to face him. He waited. "I want to show you something tomorrow," she said. "I want to take you to the eastern field, the orchard section from the plan. I want you to see what it looks like now, 3 years after we implemented it." We, the pronoun was new. She had not used it before this week, not with any weight. We. As though the work had been shared from the beginning, as though they were looking back at something they had built together, rather than something she had built while he was absent. He understood why she used it. Not to rewrite history, she was too honest for that, but to indicate direction, where they were going, rather than where they had been. "I'd like that," he said. "I know you would." She said it simply, without performance. And then, very briefly, she touched his arm, just her hand on his sleeve. One moment, warm and deliberate, before she went upstairs. He stood at the foot of the stairs. He put his hand over the place on his sleeve where hers had been. He stood there for a long time. In the morning, they went to the eastern field. Margaret Fulshie's statement arrived that afternoon, delivered by her granddaughter, written in that careful and uneven hand, and signed with a signature that was clear and firm. The dismissal records arrived from the estate the following morning, sent in response to Abigail's instruction from Renner's office. Renner filed the response to the deed claim by the end of the week. The preliminary hearing was set for 6 weeks later. Grafton's claim was dismissed in 40 minutes. The magistrate, a man named Aldous who had presided over county disputes for 20 years, read the counter-evidence, heard Margaret Fulshie's statement delivered in person, reviewed the dismissal records for both Grafton and Birch, and looked up from the papers with the particular expressions of a man who has seen people waste the court's time before and is not impressed. "Claim is dismissed," he said, with notation that the witnesses for the plaintiff appear to share a documented history of record falsification with the plaintiff himself. Grafton walked out of that courtroom without looking at anyone. He did not look at William. He did not look at Renner. He looked, once, at Abigail, and she looked back at him with the steady, unimpressed gaze of a woman who dismissed him 3 years ago and had simply been waiting for him to understand it fully. He looked away first. Outside the courthouse, Renner shook William's hand and then turned to Abigail. "The eastern acreage question is settled," he said. "Unambiguously settled. Nothing Grafton or the Aldrich Group files from here will have standing." He paused. "Lady Harrington, I owe you an apology for keeping the Caldwell precedent from Lord Harrington. I thought I was protecting your work. I understand now that I was perpetuating the..." He searched for the right word. The Eurasial said quietly. "Yes," he held her gaze. "I won't do it again." She nodded once. "See that you don't." They returned to Harrington Manor in the early evening. The following week, Renner came to the estate with new documents. Not legal filings. Not dispute responses. A co-stewardship arrangement drawn up carefully and thoroughly, adding Abigail's name to the official documentation of Harrington Manor's land ownership and management. She read the documents at the library desk, while William sat across from her. Not in his chair behind the desk. In her chair, the high-backed one that had always seemed slightly too large for her. He had started sitting there sometimes, because it reminded him of the angle she had spent 8 years looking at things from, and he found he needed the reminder. She read every page. She asked 3 specific questions that Renner answered in full. She crossed out one clause and rewrote it in the margin in language that was sharper and more precise. Renner looked at the revision and said, "That's better, actually." She looked at William. He looked at her. He picked up the pen from the desk and held it out to her. She took it. She signed. He signed beneath her. And Harrington Manor, the land, the fields, the orchard acreage, the tenant cottages, the school with its repaired roof, The east-facing rooms with their morning light became, officially and on paper, and in every way that the law could reflect, what it had always been in practice. Theirs, not his, managed by her invisible hands, not hers, hidden under his name. Theirs. The months that followed were not a fairy story. William had been right that he would fail some days, and he did. There were evenings where old habits asserted themselves, where he spoke over her in a meeting, or made a decision that should have been shared, without thinking to share it, or came home from somewhere and talked for too long about himself before asking about her. On those evenings, she told him, plainly, without cruelty but without softening it either, because she had done enough softening for one marriage and she was done with it. And he listened, and he adjusted, and he came back the next morning and tried again. That was not a small thing. That was in fact the largest thing. She signed no divorce papers. They stayed where he had put them, in the top drawer of the library desk, face down, and as the months passed and the drawer was opened for other things, letters, records, correspondence, neither of them mentioned them, until the day Abigail opened the drawer for a seal, and found them there, and took them out, and looked at them for a long moment. William was at his desk. He saw her take them out. He did not speak. She tore them once, then twice. She dropped the pieces in the wastebasket beside the desk without ceremony and went back to what she had been doing. William sat very still. Then he looked back at his own work, but his hands were not entirely steady for the next several minutes, and he did not try to pretend otherwise. Charles Mercer came at Christmas. He came with the wariness of a man who has received good reports from his sister and is not entirely willing to trust them yet, because he has loved her long enough to know that good reports have preceded disappointments before. He arrived at Harrington Manor with his coat on and his hat in his hands, and the look of a man ready to make a quick exit if necessary. William met him at the door. Charles looked at him. "She's well," William said, not defensively, not proudly, just as information given to a man who needed it. Charles studied him. "She's more than well," William continued. He stopped, found the right word. "She's herself. More herself than I've seen, than I allowed myself to see." He held Charles Mercer's gaze. "I have a long way still to go. I know that. But she is well, and that is because of her own strength, not because of anything I did. And I am trying to be someone who deserves to be beside her while she's that strong." Charles was very quiet. He looked at William for a long measuring moment. Then he stepped inside. He found his sister in the library, not at the guest chair across the desk, but at the writing desk beside the window, the one that had always been hers, working on the estate's spring planning documents with the absorbed concentration of a woman doing exactly what she was meant to do. She looked up when Charles came in, and her face broke open in the specific, uncalculated way it did, with the people she actually loved, and she stood and crossed the room and put her arms around him. Over her shoulder, Charles looked at William. William stood in the doorway. Charles gave him one slow, deliberate nod. It was not forgiveness. It was not approval. It was something quieter and more honest, the acknowledgement of a man who has watched his sister struggle for years, who has come to see with his own eyes whether anything has actually changed, and who has seen enough to let the verdict rest for now in something other than suspicion. It was enough. It was everything. Later that evening, the four of them, William, Abigail, Charles, and Charles's wife Eleanor, who had come quietly and said little but watched everything, sat around the dining table and ate a meal that lasted 3 hours, because there were too many things to say, and no one was in a hurry. Abigail talked about the spring planting, about the orchard expansion, about a new proposal she was developing for a small lending library in the village, funded by a portion of the estate's proceeds, managed by Miss Parrish. She talked about her own work, the way a person talks about something that belongs to them, openly, without minimizing it, without folding it small enough to fit in a drawer where no one would ask about it. William listened. He asked questions. He asked 3 questions at that table that he had never asked anyone before, not because they were difficult questions, but because he had spent 40 years believing that he already knew the answers, and so had never bothered to ask. And the answers were better than anything he had already known. At the end of the evening, when Charles and Eleanor had retired and the house was quiet again, William and Abigail stood in the library together, the same library where 8 days and 8 years and 3 words had broken everything open. She was looking at the box on the shelf, the wooden box, dark with handling, that held all those years of her hidden life. "I've been thinking," she said, "about taking the documents out of the box." He looked at her, not destroying them. She turned to face him, filing them proper records. Under my name. A pause. Where they belong, he crossed the room. He lifted the box from the shelf. He held it out to her. She took it. She held it for a moment, all that weight, all those years, all those pages of effort that had been folded away in the dark because there had been no one to hand them to. Then she looked up at him, and she was smiling. Not the careful, composed expression she had worn through all of that first terrible morning. Not the guarded half-smile she had offered through the days of careful rebuilding. The full smile. The one from the portrait. The one her mother had painted into ivory and written 4 words beneath so that someday someone would remember who she was. "Come help me file them," she said. He sat down beside her at the desk. They worked together until midnight, sorting, dating, labeling, placing each document in its rightful order in the estate's official records, where it would remain as evidence of what had actually happened here, who had actually built this, whose hands had actually held Harrington Manor together through debt and disease and labor disputes, and one long, costly silence. Her name went at the top of every page, where it had always belonged, where it would remain now, permanent and documented and true, for as long as the estate stood and the records held and anyone cared to look. Because Abigail Harrington had never been invisible. She had only been surrounded by a man who had not yet learned to see. And in the end, after the 3 words that froze him, after the box of hidden years, after the library floor, and the brother's warning, and the old woman's testimony, and the torn divorce papers in the wastebasket, in the end, he learned. He spent the rest of his life learning, and she spent the rest of her life being exactly, entirely, unapologetically herself, known at last, seen at last, standing in her own light at last beside a man who had finally understood that the greatest thing he would ever do was not build an estate, or win a dispute, or carry a name forward into history. It was to stop, to look, to ask, and to spend every remaining day making sure she knew, without question, without the shadow of a single unasked question between them, that she had always been worth knowing. That was the love he had almost lost. That was the love he never took for granted again.